This is the scientifically horrifying process that individuals and especially young children have to go through to create their own lightsaber. Adding lightsabers onto the growing list of unconventional weapons that I've busted out my scientist background to overanalyze on this channel. As one of the most iconic weapons ever, the way lightsabers are created in Star Wars is kind of strange, as it requires the individual attempting to make one to go through a rather deadly ritual that kinda gives no quarter for the person attempting it, as well as requires that individual, if they survive, to bond with a living crystal or make it their slave, and construct the weapon through a way that could easily kill them. And if any of these steps are skipped, making a lightsaber becomes rather impossible, with the blade simply refusing to turn on, or more likely with it turning into a fairly large bomb that will instantly kill you and explode your house. But not to worry, cause the rest of the steps required to build a lightsaber are pretty darn lenient with what you're allowed to do and use to forge your lightsaber. Dated to the very dawn of the Jedi Order that was passed down over centuries was a ritual known as the Gathering that saw younglings or children biologically between the ages of 9 to 10 going to the sacred ice planet known as Ilum, which, if it's anything like real ice planets that are composed mainly of water that then freezes over, would see the average surface temperature of Ilum being roughly negative 13 degrees Celsius or 8.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's well below freezing temperatures, if not much worse. And these freezing temperatures could easily freeze any and all of the younglings to death, especially if they were to ever be so bold as to venture out on their own, which would see them freeze to death in just about 15 to 45 minutes. Or God forbid, if they were to take cold plunge after a plunge in the planet's ice water, if your brass balls Cal Kestis, would see that individual quickly dying of hypothermia in as little as 2 frickin' minutes. So upon landing for the Gathering, these often 6 to 8 younglings are to immediately clear the entrance to the Jedi's temple that's completely frozen over, and which is blocked by fallen snow, ice, and other frozen debris, and upon the melting of a frozen waterfall that was set to refreeze in a couple of hours, the younglings were then to venture out on their own, descending into the winding labyrinth of caves within the planet, avoiding all manner of natural pitfalls and freezing water, as the caves themselves, being littered with force-sensitive kyber crystals, performed a sort of strange illusionary effect on the younglings, causing them to have to battle against their own shortcomings and weaknesses, in what we can only describe as giving the younglings something akin to LSD, tripping them out as their visual cortex and hippocampus, which normally collaborate to create visual images of what you're actually seeing, to stop working together, as the hippocampus has fun creating whatever the heck it feels like as you go on a frozen walkabout. As the younglings rush to break through their tripped out visions, they are looking for one kyber crystal that uniquely calls out to them, illuminating itself to them if they overcome their visions, and turning a certain hue that will become the color of their lightsaber, which they now have to forge once they make it back to the Jedi waiting for them in the temple. And this is where the even stranger process for forging a lightsaber in Star Wars happens, that could end up in a catastrophic explosion if done incorrectly. You see, once having completed their trip on Ilum, the younglings on board the ship known as the Crucible meet with an ancient droid called Hewing, who promptly teaches them how to construct their lightsabers and helps them to choose the necessary materials, pulling from a vast treasure trove of unique materials. But really, besides the unique kyber crystal, a lightsaber can basically be constructed out of anything you want, like really cool metals, even shinier and rarer metals, and wood, as in the case of the Wookiee youngling, because he can. And growing up as the kid who was as interested in watching the movies as I was in figuring out how to train myself out of my speech impediments, I dig the Wookiee's off-brand choice. The parts needed for a Jedi to make a lightsaber are actually quite basic and plentiful when it comes to the Star Wars galaxy, as all you need is an emitter where the blade comes out, a battery, a sleeve for your hand to grab on the hilt, a switch to turn the lightsaber on and off, a pommel to look cool, and the kyber crystal that can also be found on less terrifying planets, or in Luke's case can even be forged in a basic oven oven just because. Other than a few basic parts that even Luke managed to scavenge on Tatooine, all the lightsaber needs to work is a common magnetic ring to be placed on the emitter that surrounds the blade, turning it into a sword, and is responsible for giving off the lightsaber's really cool humming and swishing sounds. It's also responsible for containing the lightsaber's heat that runs anywhere from 15 to 30,000 degrees Celsius, or 3 to 6 times hotter than the surface of the sun, which would see everyone in the surrounding area instantly lighting on fire when the lightsaber's ignited. But still, a Star Wars muggle could never hope to make one of these, as the Kyber crystal itself not only needs to bond with its user and become activated by them, but apparently it's impossible to place them correctly inside the lightsaber through any non-force method, to which the Kyber crystal becomes annoyed and slightly ticked off, cracking and causing the lightsaber to explode, killing whoever dared to use it that didn't place it with love using the force. And seeing how the Kyber crystals actually channel the nearly 7 megawatts needed to activate and hold the blade, which is the power needed to activate a nuclear generator, this ticked off crystal lightsaber explosion could likely encompass a blast radius comparable to the smallest nuclear weapon or rocket ever used, called the Davy Crockett, that would encompass a blast radius of at least a couple hundred feet. Heck, even the Death Star needed its Kyber crystals to be installed with snuggles using the Force, or else the Empire would have the mother of all explosions on its hand. And what's so cool is, depending on who the Force user is, the Kyber crystal will naturally turn itself into a certain color and thus give the blade a specific hue, often immediately presenting itself as being blue, green, purple, or yellow. But the crystal can also be manipulated into changing its color, with individuals like Ahsoka balancing the Force inside her crystal to turn her blades white, as is the opposite for Sith, whose ritual includes them hunting down a Jedi, taking their Kyber crystal, and then bleeding it red with the dark side, which just leaves us to wonder who the heck installed the green-hued crystals into the Death Star twice. But what I found to be so strange is that even after the Younglings' death-defying passage to build their own lightsabers, which doesn't guarantee that they'll be chosen by a master, in which case they'll become a farmer, a lightsaber can be created without the need to even find a crystal. After Luke lost Anakin's blue lightsaber to his father on Bespin, he went to Obi-Wan's old home on Tatooine and found a manual for basically how to be a Jedi. Within the manual was a set of basic instructions for how Luke could craft a lightsaber, in which he went around Tatooine dumpster diving, buying and bargaining for the basic materials. Luke then put some ingredients inside a small furnace and waited for the ingredients to be cooked together, forming a gem for him to use as a makeshift Kyber crystal. Luke carefully triple-checked each of the steps mentioned in the book, and after nearly a month of carefully crafting his saber, Luke walked outside to finally test it, telling R2 to run away so he could tell Leia in the event of his death, and making sure that he did it outside so he wouldn't take out Obi-Wan's house in the explosion. But luckily for Luke, the lightsaber worked with the Force-infused crystal turning green. But if none of this was very interesting, then I saved an interesting fact for last. Like real swords, cutting off someone's appendage in Star Wars is actually a trained technique called Cho Mai, which means to cut off one appendage, or Obi-Wan's heavily trained Cho Mok, where you cut off many limbs, with one of the only individuals that laughs at this technique being Wolverine, with us going over the science behind how his claws work in this video. See you in the next one.